and welcome to an Apple a Day with Dr. Amanda. I'm so glad you're here. Have a seat, get a cup of coffee, maybe an apple, and join us for an exciting adventure this week because our theme is how to build reading skills. And I'm so delighted to have my friend and colleague, Natalie Heller, who's a reading specialist with me today. So again, before we start, like, share, subscribe, and tell a friend. And again, hopefully you continue to tune in because there's so many exciting resources and discussions about the importance of building reading skills and how do we use that effectively so that all students have access to learn to read, since that's such an incredible skill for every student. So again, Natalie, thank you for joining me. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks for inviting me to talk to you today.
You're welcome. So, Natalie, what are the most important components of reading?
Well, according to the National Reading Panel, there are 5 big areas of literacy, and those are phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary, and reading comprehension. I'd also add oral language and motivation and engagement to that list as well.
Okay, thank you. And why is explicit reading instruction important for all students?
Well, explicit instruction really directly explains the skills, the rules, and the reasons of how our language system works. So it really takes away the mystery of how the written language works for students, and it replaces it with clear explanations and demonstrations about how to apply these skills. Explicit instruction also provides guided practice and feedback for students to learn from their errors quickly, as opposed to constantly or consistently making errors. It removes the opportunity, hopefully, for any errors to occur. But again, if they do happen, there's immediate feedback that's given to recorrect or retrain the brain. All students get benefit from direct and explicit instruction, but our struggling readers are the ones that really truly benefit the most. Explicit instruction is systematic. That means that there's a very clear scope and sequence of how the skills build upon each other. It creates a cohesive connection between the skills that are taught and skills that have been mastered already. Then the skills on this continuum, they move from the easiest skills all the way up to the most complex. And when we're talking about direct and explicit instruction, these skills are also very recursive. That means they're always revisited, they're always infused with the mastered, the learned, and the material that's being taught. So that's pretty much what explicit instruction is. It's taking the mystery out of how the code of reading works.
Thanks, Natalie. So I like just really to hear what you said at the final conclusion of what you're speaking about is really taking the mystery out of how reading works and the coding of reading. And I also like how you talked about explicit instruction really is no guesswork, but that you provide students with feedback, immediate feedback, and it helps to really reduce those errors and also avoid having them make errors in the future, right, unknowingly or without actually understanding what it is that they need to hear or speak out. So thank you for that. And also, importantly, you talking about there's a specific way to do this, whether you have that introduction, ongoing review, and then mastery, and how you would also look at that. So thank you. So again, audience, if you're not familiar with this, just know you can also listen to this again, but we'll also continue to be talking about this. And Natalie has some amazing resources, not only for if you're educators, administrators, but also for parents out there. So Natalie, what have you found to be most effective in teaching reading?
I basically thought about when I sit down to work with students, what does my lesson plan look like? What are the components within my lesson plan? And the very first thing that I begin every lesson with, and it doesn't matter whether it be the very first lesson or introduction to a skill I'm teaching or the last one, I always start with a very clear objective. And by clear objective, I mean that I am telling the students exactly what skill are we practicing that day? Why are we practicing it that day? How are we going to practice it? And then I'm going to also tell them or give them some criteria of how they will know whether they have mastered that skill. So for example, if I'm teaching a phonics lesson, and again, I am a reading specialist. I teach in an elementary building, K-5, but my wheelhouse is really primary. So my examples tend to be in the primary grades. So if I'm teaching an introductory lesson to phonics and working with CVC or consonant, vowel, consonant, or closed syllable words, I would tell the students some type of an objective that would be, today we're going to be reading words, we're going to be reading phrases, and we're going to be reading sentences and texts that contain words that have the closed syllable inside of them. A closed syllable is one vowel followed by a consonant, and when we see that pattern in a word, we know we're going to read a short vowel sound. The reason why we practice reading words with closed syllables is because if we can get to a word and we're unfamiliar with how to read it and we recognize that pattern, it's going to help us figure out what vowel sound to read, and we're going to be able to read that word more quickly. We're going to know that we are successful if we're able to read all of the words on my word list or my piece of text without making any errors when we get to a closed syllable word. Something else that I always do when I am teaching a lesson is I provide feedback, and I spoke a little bit about this earlier. So when I talk about feedback, I'm talking about clear feedback immediately. So I want to make sure that children know specifically what I'm praising them for or correcting them on. If I'm only using generic feedback, it can be really confusing. They're not going to understand what it is they're doing correctly and what it is they continue to need support with. So for an example of generic feedback is, great job reading those words. It's feedback that slips from my mouth all the time, but knowing how important and critical feedback is, I know now that I need to make sure that I tell them exactly what they're doing. It's not great feedback because the student doesn't know what was done that was great. Was the fact that they finished reading those words what was great? Was it great that the children decoded those words correctly? Was it great that they were read automatically? Was it great that they came to errors and they fixed them? Was it great that when they got to a word that they didn't know how to read, they were able to apply a strategy correctly? They're not unsure of what they did well. Mm-hmm. So feedback that would be much more helpful to a student would be something more to the effect of, great job reading those words. I really liked, however, I liked that whenever you got to a tricky word, you found the letter that spelled the vowel sound and thought about the pattern of a closed syllable and about how when one vowel is followed by a consonant, you knew to read it with a short vowel sound. So that would be a much better example of positive feedback, telling the student exactly what they did well, praising them for applying a skill that was taught. On the flip side, if I need somebody to fix a mistake or to check their reading or is still really struggling, instead of saying, you read that wrong, go back and fix it, I might say something to the effect of, let's check that word. When you got to that word, you read the first sound in the word correctly, and you read the final sound in the word correctly. Let's look at that vowel sound in the middle. There's one vowel in the middle, and after it, there's a consonant. When we see that pattern in a word, we know we're going to read it with a short vowel sound because it is a closed syllable. And then I would go on to model and demonstrate that again. Like I would model one vowel followed by a consonant. I'm going to read it with a short vowel sound. Watch and listen to me read using the appropriate scaffolding that that child needs. Then I would ask that child, I'd say, now you try it and provide feedback upon how he or she did. And then I would follow it up furthermore by presenting 2 or 3 more examples where that child could practice that skill with me sitting right there and able to provide that feedback, and hopefully making those corrections in their brain so that they'll be able to continue on and be more successful. I use a lot of routines when I'm teaching. Routines are so critical. They're critical for classroom management, for behavior management. But when I think about routines, I think about all of those components, but I'm also thinking about instructional routines. So I have very consistent ways of teaching specific skills and ways for practicing those specific skills. This way, students don't have to really use too much brain power up on thinking about how are we doing this today. I'm trying to keep up with me on the how we're doing it, and they can focus more on the what is the skill and applying it to their reading and their spelling. If I have routines that are set in place, it's going to provide way more time for teacher feedback and a lot more student engagement, and it's going to provide more opportunities for students to participate and get much more repetitions and practice. So routines are really, really, really important. Whenever I teach, I try to make things as multisensory as possible. We know that the current research on how the brain learns to read shows that the more senses that we can get involved and the more modalities that we can incorporate into teaching and practicing, the stronger those connections between all of our systems in our brain are going to be. So when students are using a multisensory approach, they're more engaged, they're more immersed during whole group and small group and individual lessons, and even during virtual lessons right now. If I happen to be in a whole group teaching situation, which doesn't happen for me personally very often, but as a classroom teacher, it happens on a daily basis. It is very easy to quickly scan the room if kids are being in multisensory, because you'll see their fingers moving, they'll see their fingers tapping, you'll see their pencils or their markers moving, and I can tell instantly who's engaged and who's not. And it will help me to be able to put my focus on those kids that are not engaged, or if I can see what they're doing, their errors, I can get to them a lot quicker. And when I say multi-sensory, I think I said, you know, you do use more than one sense. So I often tell my kids and I'll talk about this a little bit later, so I'm kind of skipping ahead, but one of the routines that I use is when we're doing spelling or dictation. We always say the word and we say the sounds, and then they say the sounds while they're actually writing the letter or letters that match the sounds. And I always tell those kids, I say, if you can feel the pencil moving, if you can see the pencil writing, you can hear your mouth saying those sounds. I said, you know, I always like to tell the kids, I'm like, you're really helping your brain learn. You're helping your brain learn faster. I said, it's like all of that smartness is coming up through your fingertips and up your arm, to your shoulder, up your neck, and into your brain. So kids get a kick out of that, but it really is true. The more senses we can get involved, the better. Every lesson that I do involves the gradual release model, which is, for layman's terms, we say I do, we do, you do together, you do by yourself. So whenever I do a lesson, I always give my objective, and then I say, watch me, it's my turn. And I model specifically what it is that I want students to do, and I model specifically how to apply the skill or strategy to what I'm teaching. And their job is just to watch and to listen. When I do an I do, it's an opportunity for me to do a think aloud, some problem solving out loud for students so they can hear what my brain is actually thinking and processing. And then the we do is when I do it with the students, whether it be whole group or small group or individually, so that they still get me as a guide and they can hear other people and see other people doing it as well. The you do together is where students are doing it with their peers. So they still get that support of a group helping them, and hearing others do but it gives me the opportunity to kind of swivel around and listen, and can stop the group and provide that feedback again if needed. And then the you do component would be when students have their individual turns doing and practicing the skills that I'm instructing on. And I'm listening to one student at a time and actually providing that feedback on an individual basis, and I'm tracking their progress. Something else that's really, really critical, pacing, which is something that I feel is truly an art form for teachers. I love this quote that I had heard, and I actually had to look it up to see who said it. I think you would say Alet Cox says, "Go as fast as you can and as slow as you must." So what that really tells us is that as teachers, when we're teaching, remember I talked about that scope and sequence that we have when we're providing instruction. We tend to really get stuck if we have a group of students or a class of students and we go, oh, those few students over there really just don't get it. And we seem to get stuck teaching the same thing over and over and over again until every single child has mastered it. But what we know now is as long as we have between like 60 and 70% of our class that is mastered that skill, we need to move on, and we'll take care of the rest of those students that still need support on certain skills, whether it be in small group or intervention type setting. So we don't forget about those students, but we also don't hold the other ones back. So pacing can be thought of in regards to a classroom and a curriculum for a school year. When I talk about pacing, or when I think about pacing, I'm thinking about the speed in which I'm teaching. Everything I do is fast, meaning I have routines in place. So when I sit down in front of students, I tell them what exactly we're going to be learning about and practicing and my objective. I do my turn first. I go through it, and then I have my routine set out that my students can practice their we do's, you do together, and their individuals, and it's really, really fast. My goal is to get as many repetitions practicing a specific skill as possible in a session, because we know that practice makes perfect. And so when I talk about pacing, I'm talking about reducing teacher talk and increasing in student engagement and student participation and student response time. That means I plan everything out when I write a lesson plan. I think about the words that I'm going to use to say when I explain what it is I'm teaching. I think carefully about my manipulatives to the point where I'm having systems put into place, because sometimes I push into classrooms, so I bring everything with me in my little to-go bag. And so everything is, extremely organized to the point where as I'm teaching, I know how to hand out materials. Children know how to handle materials, when to use them, when not to use them. And so all of that, those decisions and considerations go into pacing. So I think that's something that we don't think about as much, but the more experience you have with teaching, especially when you're using the explicit and direct teaching model, I think that's something that will really start to come up, and you'll start thinking about how can I get kids more opportunities to respond.
Absolutely. So thank you, Natalie. You gave a lot of really great examples and really made it clear to understand. I know when you started, one of the big things that you talked about was making sure your students know the purpose, the why as to what they're doing. So the how, the what, the when, and why they're doing it, so that they have, just like any one of us, right? We want to know, what does that mean? Like, what is going to happen next? And it gives them that understanding. And I also liked how you shared about, again, you went in again about the importance of that feedback. But the one big thing that you really talked about through all that is having those routines and expectations in place. And also, because that really is, there's no guesswork, but also helps students and yourself, so you know exactly what the plan is. But also I enjoyed where you talked about making sure that you have teacher modeling, you have guided practice, but the students are engaged. So you talked a lot about engagement. So not just you doing the teacher talk, but really the students talking, so you can hear and have that formative assessment or understanding, okay, where are they? Are they doing this okay? Do they understand? And how do you need to adjust instruction? So I know that you talked a lot about that as well. And I really like that you brought up pacing, because pacing is important. And I think, and I'm not sure if you agree, but a lot of times we have that mindset, even in special education or looking at at-risk students, that we need to go slower. And a lot of times what our students need, especially with explicit instruction and really good systematic instruction, is a good pace, right? And like you said, you want to go fast, but also, slow. And so really having that balance where it's not super, super too quick where they can't even respond, but in a way, because research does show when we have a good quick pace, especially for our kids who may have attention deficit or different processes, they need that. So I really like how you brought that in, because I think that's an important critical piece, and it does take some time to really learn how to do that and continue to grow in there. So thank you for all that information. And then I know you did say you mentioned some of the different ways, practical ways to teach reading, but can you just also share some other ways that might be practical to help support students in reading instruction?
When I teach, I always begin my lessons with phonological and phonemic awareness. Those are skills that we know that are really critical for readers. I usually do 2 to 3 really fast-paced warm-ups depending on my grade level. And I have all of those different routines that go in to making sure that those happen really quickly. After I would do a phonemic awareness lesson, or warm-up, I'm sorry, a phonemic awareness warm-up, my lesson moves on to practicing the phonics skills, if that's what my focus is. And when I teach a phonics lesson, I'm always starting with the smallest unit. For example, the letter or letters that are spelling the sounds that we're going to be practicing, those graphemes. So we always do some type of drill. Maybe I have a card pack which has those graphemes on cards, and we flash and we read those. And what I usually have students doing is with their fingertips, they might be writing those graphemes on the table while they're reading them with me. I sometimes have like a grid with the different graphemes where they'll trace the letters and read them for me. Sometimes I do a dictation where I say the sound and you have to write the graphemes that match it. Then it progresses into those bigger units, which would be words, reading or spelling words, reading phrases, talking about what is a phrase, why are we practicing those phrases, which connects to the fluency piece. Fluency is something that we're looking for in all areas and all skills, being fluent with every skill that we teach: phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, the phonics, the reading. We want fluency across the board with all of those things. Reading sentences, and then finally text, and also spelling, being able to write with the fluency. So if I am doing a spelling dictation, something that I always do is begin with that phonemic awareness, because we know if we want other words to be orthographically mapped in our brain so that they become automatic, we need to really build that phonemic awareness. So we always say the word, or if it's a multisyllabic word, they'll say the word. I say the word, then my students repeat the word. My students echo the word. And the reason why I always want them to echo or repeat my word is because it helps me to make sure that they've heard the word that I said correctly. I'm checking for and listening for articulation. Oftentimes students drop off sounds at the end, or they're not forming sounds correctly. So it gives me an opportunity to be able to provide feedback on that, because if they're not hearing it correctly, they're not going to be able to make that connection to the letter or letters and match those sounds. So I always make students repeat that word. After that, then we always listen for all of the sounds that we can hear in the word. We say all the sounds that we can hear in the word. And after that, then we go ahead and we write about it. We think about the letter or letters that match those sounds, and we say those sounds while we write those graphemes. Then we go back and we check it, whether it be touching and saying, depending on where they are on that continuum of skills learning, you know, being accurate to automaticity, checking, touching, and saying to make sure that they're correct and blending it together to read, or just doing a quick blend across to make sure that the letters that they printed match those sounds. So that's just an example of a routine that I use. It doesn't matter what skill I'm teaching, that's the routine that I use. For multisyllabic words, it works pretty much the same exact way, except for we break the words apart into syllables, then we segment each syllable, and then we say write each syllable, and then we read the whole entire word. So that's just one way or that I really pack a lot of punch into one type of practice. Plus, when I teach and we use those routines, it really engages a lot of the different senses. So it really truly is multisensory. They're seeing, they're hearing, they're feeling. It's multisensory. Using nonverbal cues and gestures for when I want students to respond. So I'm constantly going, it's my turn. I'll say the word can, and then my cue is I do this, and the students know to automatically repeat. So I'm not always going, my turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. It's just gestures so that we can keep the lesson moving. It's that pacing to, again, and up that engagement and up that ability to have a lot of repetitions and practice. Oftentimes, I talked a little bit earlier about the phonemic and phonological awareness. Sometimes I incorporate words that we're going to be seeing or encountering later on in word lists or in text. It's one way that I scaffold for kids. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. It depends on what my kids need, but doing everything orally first really starts to help engage their phonological processor, and then hopefully we'll link it to that orthographic processor as we move forward in that lesson and make those connections even stronger. Some other things that I think that are really critical are handwriting and letter formation. This is something that I know we talk an awful lot about in kindergarten and first grade. The reading series that we're currently using, it does do handwriting and letter formation, but again, that's just one small piece of the puzzle, and it leaves a lot of room for independent practice. But if you recall earlier, I said children need feedback and they need a lot of reps doing it correctly, and so it's a delicate balance where between just teacher modeling it once or twice and expecting children to be able to do it correctly. I feel that we actually need to spend way more time on letter formation. How do we move our pencil, where we place our pencil to begin writing a letter really can make a difference in being able to recognize those letters and being able to eliminate confusions down the line with those really tricky letters, especially lowercase b, lowercase d, the p, the q, the m and the n, so that handwriting, that letter formation is really, really, really important. Articulation, I spend a whole lot of time on articulation, having students watch my mouth. What are my lips doing? What is my tongue doing? Where is my air coming from? And explaining that to students, and then having them work in mirrors and providing that feedback to them. Again, doing that in a multi-sensory way then, and then linking it to a letter right away. Now let's write that letter and let's move our mouth that way. If students aren't saying those sounds correctly and they're not hearing those sounds correctly, that's going to cause a lot of confusions when they go to read and spell. And also, I talk an awful lot about reading, but we can't forget about the spelling and the writing component that goes along with it. Whatever I think in my brain, I can write down. Reading, when we read, we're reading something that somebody has written, and writing is a form of communication. And if you want to be able to communicate clearly, you need to be able to spell correctly and formulate and generate sentences that are coherent. A good direct and explicit reading lesson will always have some type of spelling component, whether it be spelling words, following a particular phonics pattern, and should also include like spelling dictation as well, so that you can, talk about the grammar and the conventions that are also incredibly important.
Well, thank you. So I know you talked quite a bit about, different ways to engage students. So looking at the routines and went into the specifics of how you would start a lesson, right, and continue through the lesson. And I also like how you talked about in conjunction with those pacing skills, the different cues that you might use that will support a student. So really almost going back to like having less of that teacher talk. So you don't always say my turn, your turn, but you do have it where there's less, but they know you might give a gesture or a signal and they know what to do, and you're hearing more from them and having them more engaged. And I also like how you talked about the importance of that handwriting and, spelling instruction, and really having students being able to discuss. So again, that oral language, looking at articulation. I like how you brought in that speech language component that's so important. And again, some of you out there, and I know Natalie, I'm sure, a lot of times when I go to district speech language therapists, they sometimes run our trainings, or a lot of times, because they are a nice resource to ask about, because they have a lot of things with looking at, the tongue, but you talked about mirrors, and also having kids know, where's your tongue? How does that feel? Where's your mouth? And so they can see how their mouth can form so that they can have those accurate sounds. And so again, I really like how you talked a lot about that, so that students can be part of that process and understand what they're doing. So those are really great, helpful strategies. I know not all of it, and really looking at that multisensory, which is a lot of that engagement. So you really hit on a lot of critical pieces of reading.
It made me think and sparked something that I didn't write down on my piece of paper, but that oral language. So having not just me explaining what is the rule for a closed syllable, or how do we figure out a multisyllabic word when we're not sure how to get to it, or is having those students explain it to a partner or to me, but getting them to talk as well. It's not just me talking and them giving a response to a question or a stimulus that's put in front of them. It's having them verbalize what they're learning and really becoming engaged in that process. And even in regards to like the articulation, I'll talk about how my mouth is moving, and then I'll ask them, what is your tongue doing? And getting them to engage. That's that oral language piece that's really critical. And a lot of the students that I work with are limited with that oral language. And the more that I can get them to talk, and even maybe talking about, if I give word lists, like, well, what does this word mean? Can you think of more meanings for this word? Getting them engaged in using their oral language to explain and expand upon their vocabulary, and trying to integrate that as much as possible and as often as possible really starts to strengthen their connections in their brain, and ultimately will help with their reading comprehension, which is the goal of reading, to be able to read and understand what we're reading.
That's great. Thank you for touching on that oral language component, and also looking at how important that is. So thank you for also adding to what you were talking about. And then Natalie, thinking about families and really a lot of our parents, a lot of times, even in, again, with our hybrid instruction and our online instruction, or even in school, when we're having, parents at home looking at what students are doing. What are some strategies that, and again, practical strategies for parents to support their children in the area of reading?
Today's day and age right now, in the year 2020, teaching in the pandemic, everybody's become a teacher. All parents have become teachers, and I kudos and shout outs to all of you parents that are at home holding down the fort, and while also trying to help and support your children in their education. So I think the very first piece of advice I would offer would be, please go talk to your child's teacher. Talk to your child's classroom teacher, or talk to the reading specialist that may or may not be supporting your child academically. Find out your child's strengths and to find out their needs. They may have some data, and then that they can share with you, and then explain to you what that data means, meaning what are they doing well and what do they need help with. Ask questions like, for example, what kind of specific skills are you teaching, or what should my child be able to do at this point in the school year as a first grader or a third grader? ask them for some ideas or suggestions on how to support at home. They might have different resources or activities or articles or different extra practice work that you might be able to utilize at home that's going to really target it exactly what your child needs. So that would be my first thing, would be go find out what does your child need. Don't waste time on working on things that they might have that's under control and secure. I would say, please talk to your children. Talk to your children all the time. That oral language is so incredibly critical, and we really cannot discount that or discount the importance of that in children becoming literate. Use the proper vocabulary, words to explain concepts or to name items. Try to use complete sentences and correct grammar as often as possible. So if you're in the grocery store, don't just say we're going to buy some food, we're getting fruits and vegetables. You can talk about how we're going to the produce section, and the produce section is where we find the vegetables and the fruits, and let's name them with their specific names and describe how they taste and things like that. So just keep talking. Just keep talking to your children. I'm sure everybody has heard my next one, which is read to your children. Read to your children as often as you're able to. When children listen to stories, they're hearing, they're really hearing language and sentence structure that's different than normal conversation language and sentence structure. Exposure to different grammatic styles. I don't think that's how you would say that, but you know what I'm trying to say. Different sentence structures, things of that nature. Exposure to that is going to help them in the long run with their reading comprehension. When children are listening to you read, they're learning the importance of the story is coming from those words. That written language, when I think it in my brain, I can write it down. Writing is a form of communication. When you're reading a book, you're not making the story up. You're reading what the author wrote, and you read exactly what the author wrote down. It provides so many opportunities for discussion. You can discuss words in the story. What does this word mean? Or how can we figure out what this word means? You can discuss about how characters are feeling, what happened at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. You can talk about your favorite parts in the story. You could think about different endings for stories. Oh, if you were the author, how would you end this story? And talk about that. So there's so much that you can do with a child when you're reading to them. So take those opportunities. If you have children that are in preschool and kindergarten, work with your child to learn not just the names of the letters and not just sing the alphabet song in order, but more importantly, the sounds that are associated with those letters. That would be really important. There's a whole lot of different computer games and apps out there that are really great for children. It's not difficult to find those kinds of resources. Something that people may take for granted, but as teachers we don't, especially for our incoming kindergartners and sometimes even our first graders, is we want our children to come in and they're learning to become readers, writers, and spellers. And in order to be a writer and a speller, they need to know how to use a pencil. So they need to have that. They need to have that manual dexterity. They need to know how to hold a pencil correctly. So if you can get pencils into their hands and crayons into their hands and help them with that, that's just going to make life a whole lot easier once they come to school. If your children come to you with questions and you don't have an answer, help them find the answer. Help them look up the answer. Go to the internet, find credible sources, find books, whether it be from the library or in your home. Look up the answer and discuss what that answer is. And if your child's really interested in particular topics, go find more books, whether it be at the library, at the bookstore, in the classroom library, or on the internet. about those topics and indulge your child as long as it's an appropriate topic. And ask your child, well, what did you learn when you were reading about whatever it is? And if they can't, read it yet because it's too difficult, read it to them. And again, have that discussion, that oral language, that comprehension, that processing and understanding. When children start bringing their books home, because they're going to be bringing books, they're going to be bringing reading passages, things like that home, to take a few minutes, listen to your child read. That's really important. That gives them extra practice using what they're learning in school. If they make mistakes when they're reading, ask your child to go back and to look at those letters in the word and think about the sounds that match those letters and to try reading it again. If they bring home books, because sometimes we always have those kids that want to have the big chapter books, but they're not quite there yet. We don't necessarily discourage that, but we just know, like, you may need to read to them first, and then maybe they can read back to you, or you can read it together. But listen to your children read and just be really positive and supportive. Encourage writing. We talked a little bit about the pencil grip and just using and manipulating crayons and pencils, but also just encouraging writing. What I think in my brain, I can write down. Leave those little short notes for your kids to find. They're going to get really super excited. And guess what? They're probably going to want to write back to you. If they don't know how to spell something, help them think about the sounds they hear and what letters would match those sounds. If it happens to be a letter or set of letters that they haven't learned yet, or spelling pattern they haven't learned yet, just tell them how to spell it. But if they're excited to write and spell, just encourage that and help them out a little bit. If you're making a grocery list, explain to them, like, whoa, I'm making a list because I don't want to forget. And so I'm going to think about it and then I'm going to write it down, and show them that list and show them all the different things that you're writing, so that they can see that writing is really critical, an important skill that we need to have. You can do phonemic awareness at home. Now, phonemic awareness, I can't believe I didn't really explain this earlier, but for those of you who aren't really familiar with those terms, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. Phonological is like the big umbrella term that's talking about hearing. There's no print. You can do it in the dark with your hands behind your back. It's hearing bigger units in words. So that's things like, do these words rhyme? Onset and rhyme, at, cat, onset and rhyme, and syllables in words. And then we talk about phonemic awareness, which are the individual sounds that you can hear in a word, the individual phonemes in a word. So ask your children, if they're really young, what's the first sound you hear in the word, blah, 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 blah. And you can talk about their toys. What's the first sound you hear in the word monster high doll? Is the first sound I hear in the word monster. How many words are in that? Monster high doll. That's 3 words. Like, talking about things like that you can hear. Listening for rhyming words, or singing songs that have rhyme in them. Do these words rhyme? Nursery rhymes, good old-fashioned nursery rhymes, hearing the words that rhyme. These words rhyme. Do these words rhyme? Yes or no? And hearing all the sounds that you can hear in a word. If we go back to that example, monster, high doll, doll, all, doll, hearing all of the sounds that you can hear in a word. These are all different ways, and they're fast and they're quick. You can do them while you're cooking dinner, if you're driving down the street going to school and you're like, listen, we're in the car. What sound do you hear at the beginning of the word car? How all the sounds in car? Car. Things that you can incorporate quickly that really can make a big impact in your child's success.
Thank you. And I like how you really talk to parents about just talking and like giving practical, ways that, if they're in the grocery store, right, being able to say, let's go to the produce, rather than fruits or vegetables, or helping them know what is a fruit, or what are different names, or let's name them. Some practical tips, about talking or going throughout the day and having those interactions, that oral language, as well as looking at encouraging them, right, in different areas. So if they are looking at the beginning of sounds, or saying the beginning of sound for mouse, or even writing, and being able to be involved as much as you can with encouraging them wherever they're at. So thank you so much for those tips, and ways to really help the families and the parents to become engaged even when they're reading to their students, ways to engage them in those read alouds. So Natalie, just thinking about, I know we talked about some strategies for educators or parents. What are some books or resources that you would recommend for perhaps the audience?
Well, there's a website, and it's called readingrockets.org. And this website is, I think it's really fabulous. It's fabulous. It's fabulous for educators. It's fabulous for administrators. It's fabulous for parents. It gives a lot of information about a lot of, not just information, articles, tips, videos, and research on so many different topics. I was on looking for some information for something I'm doing at school right now, and just the wealth of topics, how to teach reading effectively, how the brain learns, Common Core standards, dyslexia, early literacy development, English language learners for our students that are non-native English speakers. Those children are trying to learn English in conversation and in reading and spelling. Information on just spelling, reading comprehension, oral language, parental engagement, and so many more different things. There's even a tab there where you can go and you can watch interviews by authors, like children's book authors. They give lots of cool themed book lists. So if your children are really interested in certain topics, or if you're a classroom teacher and you want to do some thematic reading, there's some cool book lists that are revolve around themes. There's different author studies there, and lots of information and tips on how to select and work with nonfiction text, and close reading, things of that nature. So I really recommend that. Readingrockets.org I think is a really great resource. Another website that you can go to is the Reading League. And those of you who are educators, and especially in the area of literacy, get really excited when you hear the Reading League, because a lot of the most influential leaders in brain research and how we apply it to reading are part of the Reading League. So there are so many different professional development texts, articles, and links to videos. And you can hear what all of these researchers in the field of reading instruction have to say about the science of reading. And they often contribute different materials and articles, and there's conference opportunities and things of that nature. So the Reading League is a pretty spectacular website to check in. It's kind of like a black hole. You get lost if you go there. The book called Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties by David Kilpatrick is a fabulous read. And then this book here is like the companion book. It's the Equipped for Reading Success by David Kilpatrick, Dr. David Kilpatrick. I talked an awful lot about phonemic awareness and the connection between phonemic awareness, being able to hear those sounds and words, and the advanced phonemic awareness, which I didn't really speak too much about, but falls under that category as well, and how critical that is to being a successful reader. So this book kind of summarizes all of the research in the book, The Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. So it's a real good summary. And then it provides a way, lots of resources for teachers to be able to instruct on the skills that he talks about. And so this is kind of like the application component to the other book. But when we talk about reading, this is where it's at. This is where we've seen a lot of success once in our school district, when we really started to incorporate this on a very regular, on daily, and incorporate it in everything we do. Those connections became so much stronger for students. So I highly suggest Dr. Kilpatrick's work. So those are just some things that I've been, that are on my bookshelf, my go-to. Oh, this was my summer, not quite done reading, Overcoming Dyslexia by Dr. Sally Shaywitz. It's extremely interesting to learn about children that have dyslexia, because guess what? Direct and explicit reading instruction is what these children need. So all of our struggling readers, including children with dyslexia, really truly benefit from this type of instruction. We assess them, and then how do we provide that instruction?
Great. Well, thank you so much for the resources, Natalie, the websites, as well as great reading resources that, again, that comprehensive list will be available on podcasts and the YouTube. So I appreciate that. And then, as we're coming to the conclusion of this podcast, what is one final wisdom tip that you want to leave with the audience?
I would like to talk about, just briefly, the simple view of reading. So when we talk about simple view of reading, we're going to go back to a multiplication problem. When you have 1 times 1, it equals 1. If you have 1 times 0, it equals 0, or 0 times 1, it equals 0. So if we think about reading in the terms of a multiplication equation, we need to have that oral language, and we need to have that orthographic language, which is the phonics. If I don't have oral language, 1, and I don't have the orthographic understanding, the phonics, times 1 equals that reading comprehension. If either one of these components is a 0, that reading comprehension is going to be severely limited. So that's the simple view of reading. You need to have that oral language and understanding of the orthographic component of the reading, the phonics. Reading is not a natural process. When we're born, our brains aren't programmed to be readers. Our brains are programmed to be communicators through oral language, hence why it's so incredibly important to reading comprehension. So it's not a natural instinct to be a reader. So only through highly effective, direct, explicit, multi-sensory instruction can our readers, can our students become truly critical readers. So something to keep in mind for all teachers and even parents. Reading is not natural. It has to be taught, and it has to be taught in an effective way.
Great. So thank you so much, Natalie. Again, audience, you've heard a lot, so you can go back. Natalie had some great practical strategies for educators, teachers, administrators, practical resources. Natalie, it was great to have you on here. So again, audience, like, share, subscribe, tell a friend. This whole week will be about effective reading instruction. We have different guests, and every day I'll be looking at highlighting some of these areas, and also looking at both what Natalie and we have Emily Sharp talking about reading skills and how we can help all students. So thank you again, Natalie, and I hope, audience, you're well, you're amazing, you're incredible, and join us again soon. So take care.
Thank you.